Hello, everyone. I am Stephen Blackburn from University Business, and welcome to our UB Ed Talk here today, which is entitled Digital Content Strategies That Boost Enrollment in the Age of AI. And all this is brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor with us here today, Eastern Standard. Now for some quick housekeeping items before we get to the Ed Talk, and we'll dive right in. So at the end of the main presentation today, there will be a live Q&A with our panelists here. You can submit your questions. You can do that now until the very end. You can do that via the red Ask Question box. It's the one with the red question mark in the two chat boxes there. And again, do that during the events. You can also safely download an asset that is related to today's presentation, and you can do that via the blue box with the paperclip. It's also at the bottom of your screen there as well. Additionally, at the end of the presentation, so after the live Q&A, a post-event survey will launch on your screen automatically. So we just ask that you please stay on until the very end so you can take part in that survey, because we'd love to hear from you. And lastly, you'll be pleased to know that all of you who are here today and those who registered, all of you will receive an email tomorrow from us at UB. And that email will include a link to the slides as well as the on-demand video. So look out for that. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. We have Jim Keller, who is the founding partner of Eastern Standard, where he also serves as Chief Digital and Technology Officer. Jim, it's great to have you with us today. You may now begin.
All right, great to be here. Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you everyone for joining. Quick matter of housekeeping from our side as well. I just want to point out that today's presentation is somewhat narrow in focus. We're going to be talking very specifically about some of the ways that generative AI has been influencing our content strategy, but did want to note that we do have a much broader guide available for digital content strategy for higher ed, and that is available as part of the attachments for this presentation. You should see it somewhere in your interface now, and if not, we can direct you to it after the presentation. But just wanted to make that note that obviously there's a lot to talk about in terms of digital content strategy for higher ed. This is a small piece of it, but we do have a much broader guide that may be of interest to you after the presentation. So with that, I'm going to jump right in here. Again, thank you all for joining me. All right, so starting off, why your digital content strategy matters more than ever. So just a couple of points here about why we're talking about this and why it has become even more of a hot topic in recent months and years. But a couple of bullet points. One is increased competitiveness. Many of you are probably feeling this at this moment. And the way that this shakes out for us, interestingly, is that what we see is that our higher ed clients start operating a little bit more like our B2B clients. So what I mean is they start becoming much more interested in a very lead gen, very conversion optimized, SEO optimized approach to their digital content strategy, to their websites and their web properties, because of this increased competitiveness they're seeing in the marketplace, as opposed to, say, like a more academic or institutional approach to content that has often been kind of the historical approach for higher ed and something that has been difficult for some of them to jettison. So we're seeing this increased competitiveness in the space, and I'm sure some of you have felt that already. And that is very likely due to this second bullet point, which is the enrollment cliff. As many of you know, we have this challenge where the cohort of prospective students is simply smaller than it once was, due in no small part to declining birth rates after the Great Recession. And so we have this dearth of available prospective students because of this enrollment cliff. So we have this facing higher ed as well. And then we have a pretty significant change in decision-making habits. So we've been doing higher ed websites, digital strategy for over a decade at this point. And part of the process that we go through when we do these digital projects is to assess and do research around the behavior of prospective students. What are they thinking? How are they making decisions? And the shift has been non-trivial from, let's say, maybe 10 years ago, where the general approach was students are interested in how they can make an impact, how they can change the world, and what their degree is going to allow them to do in that space. Whereas now we're seeing a much more pragmatic approach to what's going on. What is the nature of the job I'm going to get? What is essentially my personal ROI for this degree? And so we're seeing a huge shift in decision-making habits, which also opens up the door for other options, alternatives, trade schools, things like this. Higher ed is not the guaranteed path for everybody at this point. So a lot of challenges and headwinds facing higher ed at this moment, coupled with what we're going to talk a lot about today, which is changes in how search engines are looking at content and websites, and also the introduction of AI and how that is impacting not just how bots and search engines are actually analyzing content, but also the future of how your prospective audiences are going to be searching, what that looks like, the introduction of conversational search and changes that are happening right now that, obviously are a big part of the technology news between, Google, OpenAI, Bing, all these things that are going on. And so we're going to get into some detail today about how that's been influencing our content strategy, both within higher ed and also more broadly for other clients. So to that point, I'm going to start by talking about how the bots, how the AI, how the search engines analyze a website. And many of you are probably familiar with these points, but I'm going to go through them and make a few points, and it's going to influence kind of how we talk about what's next and how AI is actually influencing content strategy. So I've got three major points here when it comes to analyzing a website. And what we're talking about here is analyzing a website from the perspective of a search engine to rank it effectively, to deliver it as a result for a given keyword, search query, et cetera, especially as the landscape is shifting and changing again around conversational search and Gemini being introduced into the search results and things like that. But broadly speaking, there's a couple different ways that these bots are analyzing websites. We're looking at a couple different things. So content and content structure, not just the specific content, the text, the image, and the assets, but also the content structure, how the links are formatted, where they are, how the pages are set up. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The user experience overall and the performance. We purposely include performance here when we talk about this because it's become such a key metric as Google Core Vitals have rolled out. The actual speed and performance of your website is very, very significant in terms of how it's being ranked and how it's being looked at by Google. The third is engagement. How are people going through the site? How are bots rather tracking people going through the site? What is the time on page? What is the bounce rate? What do these things look like? I've also included 2 points here that I'm not really going to get into today, which are technical fundamentals and then authority and backlinks. And the reason I want to focus on these three that are highlighted, these top three here, is really twofold. So the first reason is these are things that we continually see higher ed clients, not just higher ed clients, but higher ed clients having a lot of struggles with finding these balances between how to produce their content, how to get it online, how to manage the fact they've got a lot of it, how to organize it and structure it, what the user experience is like on the website, how people go through multiple different websites that you may have in play, admissions websites, main websites, things like that, obviously tied to performance. And then the engagement factor, which is, how effective is our content? How are we measuring it? Things like that. So that's kind of the first reason that I wanted to highlight these three things as the primary components of the conversation for how we talk about analyzing and scoring and ranking a website. But the other piece I think is also highly relevant here, which is talking about how bots analyze websites is only really one half of the conversation, because we need to also obviously constantly think about how the human beings are looking at the websites, how they're interacting with them, and what the content is doing for them in terms of effectiveness. And so when we talk about analyzing and assessing a website, we're talking about how do we make it optimal for the search engines, the AIs to look at, but how do we make sure that in doing so, we are not necessarily alienating the actual human beings who we're expecting to make decisions based on the content that we've put out there. And so what's interesting is right now, I actually feel like there's been an increased amount of distance between these things. We're seeing techniques that are optimized heavily towards bots working better than they were before, but we need to make sure that we're managing that balance. And I do think that as Google kind of figures out how it's incorporating all these helpful content changes and all the AI stuff, that chasm will close a bit, and we'll have a little bit more connectedness between what it means to optimize for a bot and what it means to optimize for a person. So another way to think about that is this. The balance that you want to strike in terms of optimization here for both people and for bots is content, user experience, and engagement, like we talked about. And for people, the engagement part of this really needs to lead them toward decision making. When we think about content, we think about decision making and how we want to move toward it. So just kind of wanted to set the foundation here of the things that we're talking about today. We're going to get very specific about some things that we've learned by looking at how AI is interpreting content. But overall, a lot of what I'm going to be recommending is very standard best practices stuff that you might be familiar with. But what we're seeing is that a lot of folks are not following best practices. And the challenge that higher ed and everybody else is facing right now is that the cost of not following these best practices, of not finding this balance and creating this optimized website is higher than it's ever been. And it's only going to get higher as the search landscape changes, as the decision-making landscape changes. And so now is the time to start thinking seriously about what you're doing with your content, your UX, your engagement / decision-making in order to land at this optimized experience for your users because of those things that we talked about earlier, the increased competitiveness and everything else that's going on. So now is the time to start getting very serious about this stuff. And AI is just one more component that's adding to the mix of things that you need to be concerned about. So let's talk for a second, how does AI actually interpret content? So we wanted to answer this question in a way that was more than just abstract. Obviously, you can read a lot about it. You can look at the technical details. You can read what other folks are saying. But we went a little bit further, and we actually developed a tool, and this is available on our website, for our own website, which what we did is we had it look at our content. We crawled all of our own content. We ingested it into a database that AI can understand. It's called a vector database. And then we started asking it questions. And what's interesting, and again, you can try this on your own at our website, the URL is at the bottom of the page there. But what ended up happening was interesting. As we started asking it questions, the earliest versions weren't that great. They were giving us pseudo-nonsense answers, things that weren't really clear. So we tweaked it and we tuned it and we changed it until we were getting better answers, and we felt like the technology underneath was good enough that we were able to get decent answers and that it was working well enough. But what we found is we still weren't getting great answers in every case. But what was interesting is that we realized we had crossed a threshold where if we weren't getting good answers, it wasn't because the tool was broken. It was because the content of our website wasn't aligned as well as it needed to be to answer these questions. And so you can think of this tool as someone who exists, so a human being who exists, whose only experience of the world, his only interaction with the world has been through the content on your website. And they've memorized all of it. And you can ask them questions. And so when you ask a question and the answer doesn't come back great, at this point, what that leads us to do is ask, okay, so what is wrong with our content? So what we did from there is we started pointing it at other websites. So I'm going to take you through some of the things that we learned by pointing this at other websites, higher ed, B2B, healthcare, et cetera. So I'm going to go through those pretty quickly here since I know that we don't have a ton of time here today. So one of the first things we did is point it at a bunch of higher ed websites and start asking very broad questions like, do you have a chemistry degree? And generally speaking, it was able to answer these very top level fundamental questions pretty well. The details started to get a little fuzzier, and we started to learn a little bit about what the AI liked to see and how it liked to interpret content. So one of the things that we realized is that you do actually want to write some prose, but you also want to get right to the point. So what you're seeing here is a screenshot of actually a site that we designed, which is kind of a quick summary card for a program page. Your program pages are super high value pages on your website. They're high converting. They're where you're going to put a lot of effort. And there's nothing wrong with having this quick info bar. It has to be structured a specific way. It has to be very readable, but there's nothing wrong with it. But what we're generally recommending now, having learned a little bit about the level of prose that the AI likes, is we're recommending that where the opportunity exists, that you add supporting text. For example, chemistry and physics department at the university offers a 4-year undergraduate degree, Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Science, and a minor. We also offer graduate programs in chemistry. Boom, the information is right there. So just trying to find places where you can introduce very specific prose that answers questions. It really liked that, and it gave it a much higher degree of confidence when it was answering questions. So another question we asked is, how do I schedule a visit? Now, I want you to think for a second about your website. Maybe you've got some sprawling websites with a lot of department sites embedded in them. You've got a lot of content there. And so the question of how do I schedule a visit? How do I schedule a visit for what? Is it for getting a flu shot? Is it for the university? Obviously, generally speaking, we want this to be, how do I schedule a visit for, like a prospective undergrad or something like that? But it became interesting finding how many different pages there were on the site that were answering a question about scheduling a visit that weren't necessarily directed toward undergraduate admissions. So I want to show you a page that actually did a pretty good job where we got a good answer. So this is from actually NYU's website, but they have this page that is dedicated specifically to questions about being a visiting student. And so you can see that the content here is very straightforward. It's very simple. The questions are answered in a very discrete and distinct way. And so the Q&A content, the how do I do this, is structured very well. Now I'm going to make a quick point here that I'm going to come back to, which is I'm not saying that we need to throw out all of our visual flair and change everything back to giant walls of text. And we'll get into specifics about how not to do that. But I think it's worth asking the question at this point, is there a place in the site that actually very effectively answers this question? And is there too much other competing content on the site that is leading us astray? And I'll show you some other examples of where that happens as we go through here. So another question we asked, how much does it cost to attend? And again, we're kind of adopting the persona of a prospective student or a parent or whoever may be asking these questions. So again, asking the AI, which has fed your website's content, how much does it cost to attend? There was a particular website where we felt like the answers were there. We knew that the answers were there, and yet it was giving very wishy-washy answers, or the AI was telling us it doesn't really know and you should reach out and contact somebody, even though we knew the information was there. So we dug in a little bit further, and we found a graphic that looked like this, which seems to answer the question perfectly fine. But what we realized is that, at least for the Gen AI, text interpreter, it wasn't able to really look at this graphic and understand what was going on. And so there's an opportunity here to add some supporting text and something that it can really chomp into and understand. Now, I will admit that Google's AI is almost certainly better than ours. And so it is very likely much better at interpreting image-based content. And so it's not to say that it's impossible, but I think one of the points that's important here is not necessarily that we have to do everything that's perfect for the bot, but making things as easy as possible for the crawlers, for the bots, for the AIs to understand is going to give it more confidence, which is going to influence the score that you're able to get through. And also another point of interest here is that as we're talking about this, as we're talking about explaining and answering questions very distinctly and directly and not creating confusing content, those are things that are still highly relevant to people as well. So we're not, again, talking about just do this for the bots. We're talking about do this for the entire audience, humans and bots. But again, embedding information in graphics can be a bit of a challenge. We ran into something similar when we were asking different university sites, essentially, tell me about the nursing program, or tell me about this program or that program. And again, we were coming up with some interesting results where sometimes it was able to grab on and give very strong, very confident information, and other times it wasn't. And again, we found something similar as we were going through here, which is, so you see this is a screenshot we pulled from one of the websites that we analyzed here. And you can see these calls to action on the right. I just call them info boxes. I don't think they're really calls to action, but there was plenty of information about the nursing program embedded within these cards, and it wasn't picking them up. And again, we realized that once again, these were actually images that were embedded on the page. And so there's that kind of deviation from best practices where each of these, even the text was actually part of the image, making it more difficult for it to understand what's going on here, has to try to read the text from the image, which is a very different process. So again, hiding content within imagery is generally speaking something that you want to avoid. It's something that we're still seeing more of than I would have thought. There's nothing wrong with having the imagery, but if you have places on your site or blocks or modules like this, you definitely want to avoid having them be, very image based. A couple of other ones that we talked through here. So this one was kind of interesting. So this is from a B2B website, and we started to ask other kinds of questions that folks might ask to a B2B website. This was for a company that has many different office locations across the country. So do you have a location in Arlington? What it told us was that, now you can see here, this is a screenshot of the locations page. There's clearly a location listed in Arlington, but the AI was telling us that the Arlington location was going to open soon. And we thought, okay, that's interesting. Why is it telling us that? Why does it think the Arlington location is not open yet? And the reason is something that's very interesting when you think about cleaning up and cultivating your content. What we discovered, because the AI will tell us what pages it's using as the source for its answers, and we did some digging in there and found that there was a press release, an outdated press release that was talking about the Arlington location being open. And so we learned two things from that. Number one, it's critical that we get rid of outdated and antiquated content, because there's nothing to say that a user couldn't have come across that page as well, searching for Arlington location or something, depending on how effective their search tool was on the website. So clearing out old content, generally speaking, is a good idea for SEO. but becomes even more relevant when it's competing with other things on the site. The AI was leaning harder into that press release than it was into the locations page. The other thing is, again, just making sure that you're not competing with yourself on information, because that outdated information is, creating confusion both for the AI and the users. So cleaning up old content, which I know can be a very heavy lift on, large, sprawling higher ed sites, especially as you have multiple schools, colleges, departments, whatever, is highly critical, not only to the AI, but also to what we're seeing for SEO. We recently did a project where we cut down the number of pages drastically. We were very worried about the possible effects of that because we're decreasing the volume of content, but we were able to get a much, much higher conversion rate, much better traffic, and much better positioning by not diluting what the search engines were looking at when they were looking at these pages. So another interesting thing that we came across was we were asking a health system website, do you offer cancer care? And we know that this health system does. It's a big part of what this health system does. But again, the AI was getting confused. And similarly to the press release issue, we found that it was actually leaning very hard into their terms of agreement for the website, which was saying that there is no medical advice given. Now, this is another example of conflicting content, but I will make the point that what we did with this is the same thing that we suspect that Google or another search engine would do, which is we degraded the value of this kind of content when the AI was looking at it. So we said, listen, don't look at the disclaimer. Don't give a lot of weight to the terms of use and things like that. And so it's not to say that your terms of use need to go, but it's just another example of where if you have competing content, if you have things that are telling the AI different things, you've really got to consider why that might be and whether you can reduce or eliminate that confusion. Again, thinking about the AI has led us to think a lot about humans and how they interact, because we know that the search tools on the websites are not always great. And so somebody can be led astray if they're on the wrong page reading the wrong thing. So coming back to a point I made earlier, which is, are you suggesting we write walls of text? And definitely not suggesting that. We need to keep the obviously level of visual engagement and things still very highly energetic, and keeping all your animations, all that stuff is fine. But just make it a point when you're answering specific questions to use clear text phrases where it is possible, where it makes sense, and where you can actually put specific answers to questions. And the other thing that I want to talk about, again, going back to UX best practices and implementation best practices, is if you're not going to have the ability or the desire to answer a question or provide information through a block of text, because we know that that can limit the total engagement, you need to make use of the tools that HTML gives you to format things so that it's easily digestible for the parser. And what I mean by that is that there's many different ways to create like an HTML structure for a page. You can use lists, grids, you can use all the tools and the accessibility techniques and things to make it so that a parser really truly understands what's going on with the content, what's related to what, and et cetera. But if you don't use those tools, it becomes very confusing as to what's going on. And I'll give you some quick examples here before we go into Q&A. So this is something that we pulled from a website talking about how certain degree programs are structured, right? And to be honest, even as a person, I'm not 100% sure what this is necessarily saying. That kind of leads us to think about, okay, what is the AI interpreting here? So is this that I need to choose one particular program from the left and one from the right, and then I add a certificate in? I think I know what it's getting at here, but the fact that it's confusing for me and the fact that it's structured this way on the page is going to lend itself to being confusing to AI as well. And so thinking about how we're organizing pages is very critical in terms of what content here is really related to another. And I'll get a little deeper into this here and show you something. So what you're seeing here is simply, this is actually a very exemplary program page from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, their extension program. So what you are seeing here is simply me using the browser's inspector tool to go through and understand how the HTML on this page is dictating that this content be structured when you're looking at it from the other side, when you're trying to interpret it, not as one single visual block, but as what's actually happening on the page. And what you'll see here is they've done an excellent job of making sure that the content itself is structured so that all these individual bits, these different degrees and facts, they all live in an individual grid, and they're all also separatable into their content. I'll show you a different view here. So this is really what I wanted to showcase, is that if you look and you can see that they're using the proper HTML structure to say these things are all related to one another, and they're related to the content above it. And if you go through and go even deeper, you can see that they are related to one another, but they are also isolated pieces of content that are directly related to each other, meaning that the stat above the text is an isolated block of information. And then there's another isolated block of information, another isolated block of information. And all these isolated blocks are related to one another, but you can parse them out and understand what's going on by looking at the code and understanding the structure of the HTML. And this is something that we see missed a lot, especially as we're going through different sites. We're looking at how AI is looking at them. And I'll give you another example. So this is another site where they're doing essentially the same thing. They're showing stats, right? But as you go through and as you use the inspector to try to figure out how the structure is related to one another, it simply doesn't end with that nice grid treatment, that parsable isolated blocks of information. You can see trying to figure out here by going through the inspector how this is all structured, whether these are related to each other, whether they're not, whether they are. And even as I'm doing it manually, struggling to even find a way that one piece of code here is related to the other, and therefore the parser is going to struggle to understand how the content is related to one another. And to give you an example of what the parser thinks this looks like compared to the other bit, it's just one giant blob of content. It doesn't know how it's related to each other. It doesn't know that these are isolated pieces of content. And so the structure does matter. And the point that I'm making here is simply to make sure that you're using the tools that HTML gives you. I mean, accessibility techniques come into play here, because if you're doing good on accessibility, you're probably using those tools. This is not some new thing that you have to do based on AI. It's just that you have to be very cognizant of how the page is being parsed. And that's true for AI, it's true for accessibility. Again, it's true for search engine optimization, it's true for everything now. So this is one of the things that we see a lot of, is that the way that the content is actually structured on the page is not lending itself to the AI really understanding and really being able to glam on to what's there. And ideally, as we move forward here, one of the things that you want to make sure of is, as conversational search continues to march forward, I don't know if you've used the brand newest version of ChatGPT, but it has sort of a pseudo search engine built into it. Obviously, Google is starting to surface AI results in it. You want to be at the top of the list and making sure that your site is the one answering these questions, and that the page structure itself lends itself to your site being understandable enough that it has a high degree of confidence. Everything that we're talking about here influences the confidence of the AI to tell the search engine product or whatever it is, I feel good about this answer, and therefore you can surface it to a user. So I know we're coming up on time here, but I just want to do a very quick recap. So a couple of major points here. Number one, both humans and bots assess websites using similar criteria. It's not a mutually exclusive conversation where doing a good job for the bots should be doing a bad job for humans, or vice versa. They're using similar criteria: content structure, user experience, engagement, and all of this is designed to move your prospective audiences toward decision-making and admissions and applications, so that we can account for some of the challenges that we talked about at the top of the hour here. Gen AI is definitely influencing how search engines read and interpret content, but tried and true best practices are still winning the day. Again, these are some specific takeaways, and they're influencing some of our recommendations for content strategy. But overall, the most significant underpinnings of good UX, good implementation, these are still things that you need to focus on, and that Gen AI is still going to reward you, because our tool operates in a little bit of a vacuum. We've done some tuning to it, but Google and OpenAI, they're going to be combining the text with everything else they're interpreting about the site. But even in that case, you want to make it as easily and as structured, as easy for them to understand, and as well structured as possible for them to understand it. So following that, there are specific practices you can introduce into your content to optimize for AI text interpreters. Again, using prose where it's relevant, making sure the structure of your page is set up so that it's easily digestible and parsable. And there are other things that you can do too to help kind of influence and tip the scales in your direction. And then finally, a combination of optimized content and well-structured layouts is what will ensure that AI can understand both the text and the context. And that second part is really important too, because again, the text ingestion part is just one piece of everything that's going on here. And so the context of the content matters as well. And so thinking about, again, that page structure and how things are set up as you move through creating your content. All right, let's move into Q&A. So what are your questions?
Perfect. Yeah, so we are at the 30-minute mark, but I do want to ask, I'm going to ask one question before we wrap it up. And if we didn't get to your questions today, and so there's a few questions in there, we at UB will share them with our partners at Eastern Standard so they can be answered at some point in the future. Let me get to this quick question. Does the AI factor in alternative text understand content in graphics or images?
Two parts to that answer. Our tool does look at alt text, does not look at images. I can say it's a pretty strong bet that OpenAI and Google are looking at text within images, and they're definitely looking at alt text. So we know that to be true. So I would say it's probably a safe bet that they're looking at text within images, but I would also make the case again that you're making it harder than it needs to be. And it's kind of like, that adage of you don't need to be, the fastest swimmer to get away from the shark. You just need to make sure that somebody else is slower than you are. And so if you're making it harder than your competitors to understand and ingest your content, you're going to score slightly lower, and it's not going to have the same level of confidence. And so therefore, you're just putting yourself at a disadvantage. So I would say, yes, it almost certainly will be looking and doing, the text to text conversion, the optical character recognition, but I don't see a reason to embed it within there. You can use the alt text. Generally speaking, I would say, steer clear of text within images if possible.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. So we are at the little over the 30-minute mark, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. And also, I just want to make it so that the people who are still here to stay on until the very end, because the post-event survey will launch on your screen automatically. So I'm going to wrap it up right here. And actually, I see more questions coming in. It's not a problem. All of them are saved on our end. So we'll any questions that you submit from now until the end, we will share them with Eastern Standard so that they can be responded to at some point. So as I go through my closing slides, feel free to continue submitting your questions. But first off, I just want to thank you again, Jim, for sharing your time and expertise with us today to talk about, boosting enrollment in this day and age with AI. It's a very big subject for sure. And of course, I want to give another shout out to Eastern Standard as well. I'd also like to take a minute to thank you, our audience, for joining us here today as well. For those of you who enjoyed our presentation, we have more UB Ed Talks like this one that are provided by us here at University Business, which is the leader in editorial coverage of news, trends, as well as current issues in higher education. We have a wide range of readers who subscribe for free to UB, and they stay up to date with us online via our newsletters. We have our longer webinar sessions, new podcasts, and our shorter UB Ed Talks like this one. Also, if you would like to watch this presentation again, or for those of you who believe that what you heard would be helpful to your colleagues, and I'm sure that is very much the case, you'll be pleased to know that our team at UB, we will be sending you an email later tomorrow with an on-demand recording of this presentation, as well as a link to the slides. And also, that post-event survey will launch on your screen in just a few moments, so hold on for a second. But with that, on behalf of UB, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And thank you again, Jim, and thank you, Eastern Standard. This was great. Oh.